Thank you. I approach this a little differently first from the perspective of a former governor. And I have to say that I once talked to the Republican leader about being a former governor, and he gave me one of the great lines that I've used ever since, which is, it was his observation that if you ask a former governor who's now a senator which job they like better, if they say senator, you know they'll lie to you about other things. I've never forgotten that, Senator McConnell. But I approach it as a former governor, and I recall in the late 90s having a good-natured competition with my good friend Jesse Ventura, who was my colleague and fellow independent governor of Minnesota. The competition was about which state would have the highest turnout in the election. And I think in 2000 we actually had a bet. I can't remember what the stakes were, but the idea was it going to be Minnesota or Maine? And I thought at the time, the whole idea of this thing was to have the most people voting. That was the goal. That was what we were all trying to do. I just thought that was the purpose of what we were doing. As I recall, in the year 2000, Minnesota beat us out by a point or two.
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. I figured you'd know that. But let me just share a little experience in Maine. We have no voter ID law. We have same-day registration. And the history of same-day registration is kind of interesting because about 10 years ago, the legislature and the governor repealed same-day registration. And we have a provision in Maine law called the people's veto, where if you collect a requisite number of signatures, the people get to vote on the legislation. And the people of Maine overwhelmingly restored same-day registration. During the period between the passage of that legislation and the repeal, there was a serious effort on behalf of the proponents of repealing same-day registration to find evidence of fraud in Maine elections. They couldn't find any. They found one or two cases in the 70s, but there was virtually nothing found. So in Maine, we have no voter ID law. We have same-day registration. We have no excuse absentee voting. We have mail-in voting. We have early voting. We have 24/7 drop boxes and no fraud. Now, I love the state of Maine. I have a great deal of respect for the people of the state of Maine, but I'm not sure we're more honest than your states, than other states that seem to feel they have to have those things in order to protect against something which rarely, if ever, happens. By the way, the Constitution makes clear in Article 1, Section 4, that yes, elections for senators and Congress are left to the states, but, as I want to be sure I get this right, the times, places, and manner of elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, semicolon. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. And I don't think we are discussing in this bill the places of choosing senators. So it's clear that there's constitutional basis for us to work in the area of voting rights. I think of this, again, as a former governor and a person who even believes in the 10th Amendment and states' rights. I don't want the federal government taking over our elections and prescribing every jot and tittle of the law of the state of Maine or Missouri or Minnesota or Texas. But I do think there's a place for the federal government to establish a floor. And to me, it's analogous to environmental law. We have a floor in this country that's established in terms of environmental law, but the states are free to make many rules and regulations and changes in the law of environmental regulation on their own, but not go below the floor that's established in federal law. To me, this is the same thing. This isn't a detailed takeover of elections, but it does establish a floor. It does say you can't do things that are designed to make it harder to vote in your state. And it seems to me that's really what this is all about. I don't see this as a partisan issue. I see it as making it easier for people to vote. And those people are going to vote for who they choose. And sometimes it's going to be Republicans and sometimes it's Democrats. And in my case, sometimes it's going to be neither. But that's really what this is all about. And then a final note about gerrymandering. I believe that gerrymandering from both sides is dangerous to our ability to govern this country. Because what happens in a gerrymandered district, whether it's gerrymandered to favor the Democrats or gerrymandered to favor the Republicans, is that the primary becomes the election. The primary determines who the congressman will be. And that means who votes in the primary. Activists, the more activist members of the party. Primaries notoriously have a low turnout. What I have observed in the last, say, 10 years is what I think is one of the most dangerous developments in American public life. It's very rarely commented on. In fact, I haven't seen any published comment on it. But you can now lose your primary not because of your position on abortion or immigration or any other issue. You can lose your primary if you're viewed as a person who is willing to listen to the other side and try to solve problems. To be a person willing to compromise is a capital offense on either side of a gerrymandered congressional district. The result of that is members of Congress who come here absolutely hell-bent to not be seen as someone who's a problem solver, to not be seen as someone who would compromise and talk to the other side. If you all think about that, that makes it impossible for us to solve problems because no serious problem can be solved without compromise. And the result of the gerrymandering in the congressional districts is that we end up with representatives that are at one extreme or the other in terms of their party representation and unable, as a practical matter, to come together to solve problems. I think that's a really serious problem, and neutral, independent bodies to make decisions about redistricting, I think would be healthy for the country, and I don't care which party because I think gerrymandering is a bipartisan problem. There are gerrymandered districts on both sides, and that just shouldn't be the way it's settled. So I think there are areas where this bill can be improved. I think there are areas that are worthy of discussion. I don't see it as intended to enfranchise any particular group of people. I think it's intended to enfranchise those American citizens who want to and should be entitled to vote without impediment. So, Madam Chair, I appreciate the work that you've done on this amendment to try to ameliorate some of the issues, particularly issues involving the disabled community. I appreciate that. Look forward to considering the amendments today and hope that we can come up with a bill that everyone can support as supporting the right of Americans to choose their leaders.